I will say before we get started this evening that we will be having a short meeting, emphasis on short, about VBS right after services tonight. Let's talk about a few things, but it should be very short. So, this evening though, we are looking at, well, it's kind of under the heading of science in the Bible. We do that from time to time. I think they're always interesting from my perspective. Hopefully you find them interesting to some degree, but tonight we're going to look at not the idea of evolution or Darwinism, but instead we're going to look at the results that happened from that. So we're not talking about the whole theory of evolution, we're not trying to disprove that tonight, but instead we're just talking about what happened after it was originated, after it was created. So one thing we're going to use though during this is a principle from philosophy. And this particular principle is that the misuse of a thing does not negate the proper use of it. Does that make any sense? If you misuse something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong. I'm trying to think of a non-politically charged example. It's kind of hard to do. But let's just use the Bible as an example. People have misused the Bible again and again for terrible purposes, and yet that doesn't make the proper use of the Bible wrong. So just because somebody uses or misuses something doesn't mean that you can't use it in a right way. But the question then for Darwinism is there a proper use for it? Or is the natural result going to be something that is negative or even worse, as we're going to look at tonight? So to do this, first we are going to look at just the most basic tenets of Darwinism so that we have a baseline for everything that we're going to talk about. And the two things we want to mention are macroevolution and then the descent of man. So the idea of evolution in Darwin's mind comes from the observation of microevolution, right? So he sees some finches. They have different beaks. Okay, great. Why? Because they have evolved to do certain things with those beaks. Okay, fair enough. But then he expands that idea and says, well, maybe finches actually can become a different bird entirely. And maybe those birds could become another species entirely. So he takes an idea that's true and observable, and then he makes a large leap into a theory, also known as a guess based on some science, to say that this happens across species, so that there are, in fact, fish that become lizards, that become mammals, and that's the basis, though, is macroevolution, meaning big-scale evolution. But then, as another part of this, kind of an implication of evolution, is the idea that man descended from some other being, that man evolved to where he is now from somewhere else. And usually this is some kind of shared ancestor with other great apes, at least according to Darwinistic theories. So when we say great apes, though, we're actually talking about a few different animals. Normally when we say ape, or I think a lot of times when we say ape, we think specifically of gorillas, but there are two other groups within the great apes, and there are also, of course, the lesser apes. That's an implication. But with the great apes, there are three. There are gorillas, there are orangutans, and there are chimpanzees. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, because we're about to talk about things that are unpleasant. Why are they unpleasant? Because they are history. They're the history of what happened after this idea came into the world, and things that people started to believe or think based on the ideas of Darwin. So it's not necessarily the case that everything we talk about tonight is what Darwin proposed, but instead what people proposed once they saw his idea and ran with it. And the first thing is this. So in this idea that man has descended from other species and shares a common ancestor with certain apes, obviously the whole concept is going to imply that some humans are more evolved than others. But one of the suggestions shortly after the publication of The Origin of Species by Darwin was that different groups of man, being on different evolutionary timelines, evolved from different species of apes. Now, I'm not suggesting this in any way. There's going to be a ton of stuff that I say tonight that I find fairly appalling, but we're going to talk about it again because it's history, because people believe this. So not a minority necessarily, even the people at one point And when I say people, I mean Europeans, because they are the ones that believe themselves atop this evolutionary mountain. They viewed themselves as potentially coming from chimpanzees, which were, according to them, the smartest of the great apes, which means that those who are non-white come from other places. The suggestion was that those who are black came from gorillas, and those who are Asian came from orangutans. Now, we know that to be entirely wildly false today, and yet it was a result, if a little misguided result, from the original theories of Darwin. But we're going to look a lot more at that kind of idea and where these ideas take us. But before we do that, or with that, we're going to look at some implications here. So, 3 things. Number 1, if Darwin suggests the theory that we are evolved from other species and that there is evolution across species, then the implication is that there are varying degrees of evolution within species, within a particular species, which means that there is, in fact, evolution within the human species. What does that mean? Well, it means that some humans would be more evolved than other humans, at least according to this idea. So, again, if you go back to the time of Darwin or shortly after Darwin, it would be most Europeans that would buy into the idea that there is a hierarchy of race. Again, not suggesting this, but this is historical. The hierarchy would have been white, and then Hispanic, Indian, as in from the subcontinent of India, Native American, and then black, and then Aboriginal, which are the natives of Australia. That is, again, wildly wrong, and of course bears no actual basis in science, but wow. So this is just early on in Darwinism, the things that we start to see take place after this idea is widely accepted. And of course that hierarchy of race is not accepted today and shouldn't be, but historically it was. Why? Because it was a result of seeing this theory. Another implication here is that we, as humans, are no different than animals. So again, if we evolved from animals, and if there is no creator, as the Bible suggests, then what makes us any better than an animal? So we've taken away all value of human life. Because if I am evolved from some lesser species, then why does it matter if I kill an animal, or if an animal kills me, or if I kill another human? Because we're all on the same playing field. We're all just organisms. So we devalue human life whenever we take this away. Of course, there's also no immortal soul then, which will lead to the next thing that we'll say, but there's no God-given value to any life, even human life, which means that you have the same value as a snail. It means you have the same value as a mushroom. It means you have the same value as any insignificant organism on the planet. Because God didn't make you in His image. God didn't say you were very good. So you're just an organism. Third implication here is that there is no moral responsibility. Again, if I am not created by somebody, I'm not accountable to somebody, why does it matter what I do? And what is evil if there is no creator? If I'm just another animal, well, I don't get to judge what a tiger does to another tiger, to another animal, to eat it. So who am I to judge if a human wants to do other wicked things? No moral responsibility, no difference between us and animals, and varying degrees of evolution within humans. A few implications, but a disclaimer to end this section here about Darwinism. Darwin is a product of his time. So I will say a couple things, not in his defense exactly, but to explain this. So Darwin is living in the mid-1800s, and he publishes The Origin of Species about 1859, I think. So he is, at this time, in an era where science is just not as developed as it is today, and which is why a lot of what he theorized is totally wrong, even by modern scientific theoretical standards. But this is a time before genetics, before any real understanding of genetics. In fact, it'd be another 6 years before Mendel comes along and the pea pods and the experiments that he does there. So we're before any understanding of genetics. We're before any real understanding of the fossil record. In fact, it's kind of excusable to suggest, well, maybe there is a missing link because they had so few fossils already uncovered. But after another 170 years, we found no more missing links. So now it's not quite as excusable as it was then, but he's basing this off of just visual observation and saying, well, if I see some small examples of evolution, maybe there are bigger ones somewhere else, and I just haven't found it yet. So again, we're not excusing him. And the other thing we can't excuse, but we can explain a little bit, is that he lives in Europe. He is in a completely white-centered culture. And based on himself and those around him, he feels superior to everyone else on the planet. And this is just a way of explaining that. According to him, it's a scientific way of explaining what he thinks he already knows. So, again, not to defend anything that Darwin taught, but it was more difficult than maybe we give him credit for to try to come up with any decent idea, unless, of course, he just looked at the Bible's explanation. But there's some tragic results of Darwinism. Tragic, really pitiful results that come from it. I don't know of any good that's come from Darwinism, actually, but we're going to look at some of the negatives. And we'll say first that every idea has its consequences. Sometimes those ideas have very small consequences, very mild, and they don't really have much ripple effect. But then sometimes the idea is world-altering, and maybe not for the better. The rest of the consequences that we're going to look at are going to be pretty racial in their basis, because that's just what the results are. But a few non-racially related things that would result. There was rapid secularization after 1859, and there are other reasons for that. Probably the Industrial Revolution plays a big hand in that, and colonization. There are plenty of reasons for anything that happens in history. But with Darwin's ideas, people are now free to have a different explanation than the Bible for the origin of the world and for the origin of humanity. So it opens that gateway for people to leave religion in droves, and a lot of them, in fact, do. The question is, has our world gotten better since 1859? In some ways, I think the world's more civil than it was in 1859. People are nicer toward each other for the most part. But at the same time, has the world gotten better in terms of the valuing of human life? I don't think so. Has the world gotten more religious? No. Has it gotten morally better? No. So there's a rapid secularization that takes place after this time period. But there's also a period after Darwin's supposed discovery of this new idea of fascination with this whole concept of evolution, and a fascination with finding a missing link. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But also a fascination with cultures that are supposedly lower on an evolutionary scale than European culture. And you see this in a lot of writings. If you look at the writings, I read last year The Land That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it shows some people visiting a place where there are less evolved humans. It's the whole basis of the book. And you think, well, okay, that's back in the 1800s. No, it's about 1916. About 100 years ago, and we're still thinking, well, maybe we're going to find some land of pre-humans, of subhumans. And you see that with Haggard, and you see that with even Doyle to a certain extent with The Lost World, and you see that in the literature of the time period. And you see that in the activities that take place. And we'll talk about some of those too. But there's a fascination after this idea comes out about all of the evolutionary implications that we just talked about. Another thing we'll mention, and people probably make too much of this, but the book, The Origin of Species, has a subtitle. And the subtitle is, it's actually kind of an or, but it's "Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." It's the subtitle. Now, there's nothing inherently racist about that if you're just talking about the survival of the fittest. But again, the implication, if you take it to the human scale, is that the most advanced race is the favored race, is the most evolved race. So the implication is going to be the same there, even just based on the subtitle of the book. Another thing we'll mention before getting to some examples, the terms used at this time were bad. They were pretty bad. but they were used by Darwin in his writing in The Origin of Species, and more so in The Descent of Man, which he wrote a little bit later on. Darwin's followers used these terms, and a lot of just common people. These words became commonplace among common people even. But words, phrases used to describe essentially non-white people. So at this time, you would find people calling non-whites not just less advanced, but they would call them subhuman, or low-minded, or degraded, or savage. Now, does any of that fly with us today? No. But back then, it was science. Back then, it was the proper understanding. These people are less evolved. And why is that? Well, because someone had a pretty bad idea about how humans got here. But these are the implications we're talking about. So let's get to some examples that seem extreme, but are actually fairly commonplace because of this idea. First example is this. Oda Binga. Kind of a fun name to say, I admit that. The story is less fun. The story is very tragic, actually. It's part of the tragic results of this section. Oda Binga is a man, a human being. Remember that as we go through this story. This is a real story, of course. I'm not going to add some fictional account here, but he was a pygmy, which means a certain people group in sub-Saharan Africa that are very short. And we're talking 4'6", 4'9", maybe, for the average height of the tribe that he would have been a part of. He's gone on a hunting expedition. He comes back, and his entire village has been slaughtered by some Europeans. He's taken prisoner, and he is brought to America. And when he comes to America, he's taken to, rather, the St. Louis World's Fair. And he is put on display. Oda Binga, the man, the human, like you, was put on display at the World's Fair. Why? Because he was being heralded as a missing link between man and animal. What year is this? 1904. It's not been too long since we were in a very bad place in our understanding of race. He is caged there, of course, and people throw things at him, people taunt him, and he's experimented on some. He would actually be moved from the World's Fair after it was done to the Bronx Zoo. Just going to pause there a second. A human being was on display in the Bronx Zoo in 1905. And he would be there for a few years. And he would be studied because he was supposed to be a missing link. And this was supposed to be scientific. He would also be taunted. He'd be humiliated. But he was on display there. Eventually, he would actually be freed. It'd be a few years. He would learn English. He would study some at a university. He would be baptized. But eventually he would take his own life because he couldn't go back to his home. We're talking about just over 100 years ago. And again, a human, was being kept as a zoo animal. And why? Because people believed in a very bad idea of how all this happened. Because people believed that they were more evolved than he was. Let's look at some other examples, though. We mentioned the Aboriginals earlier. Aboriginal is a native of any country technically, but we almost always use it of Australia. And the Aboriginal people, if you don't know what I'm talking about, are the native tribe people of Australia. They are black. They look a little different than pretty much anyone else on Earth, just based on the genetics of Australia over a long period of time. And so, based on observation, people back then thought that they were a missing link, potentially, between man and animal. Like I said, there was a fascination at this time with this. And so people would be sent on expeditions to, number one, rob the graves of Aboriginals. As in, they would take their skeletal remains and they would sell them to museums or to collectors back in Britain. But not only that, they would also hunt down living human beings, and they would shoot them, and they would often plug up the bullet holes and send them to a taxidermist to be sent back to Europe as a specimen of a missing link. What are the results of Darwinism? Beyond that, we can also talk about in the U.S. just a little bit. Darwinism is not the origin of racism, of course, but as soon as it was introduced, people started to take hold of it to say, okay, slavery, yeah, must be right. It's only right if we are the more evolved race, and that idea was promoted for a long time, unfortunately. Beyond that, not just slavery, but manifest destiny, the idea of pushing westward, but specifically in the annihilation of Native Americans. The same logic was applied, because we're more evolved, right? So it all goes back to this idea, but one more example, of course, and you know about this example, but we'll talk about it for just a minute, is the example of Adolf Hitler. So in the 1930s, starting in the 1930s into the 40s in Europe, of course, Hitler, based on the ideas of Darwin, he was directly influenced by the ideas of Darwin. He began a campaign to exterminate not only the Jews of Europe, but also the Slavs, the Poles, the Gypsies, the homosexuals, the handicapped, you name it. Anybody that he thought was potentially less advanced than himself, he said, well, okay, according to Darwinism, this is right. This makes sense. And he used it to justify his position. And not just him, Goebbels and Göring and Himmler and all of the Germans that were in charge of this were influenced by Darwin to the extent that said, yeah, this is right. We can do this. And so they killed about 21 million people. About 21 million people died. Why? Because someone had a bad idea about humanity or how humanity got here. And of course it doesn't stop with Hitler, because you can also take Stalin at the same time period, who kills probably just as many as Hitler did for very similar reasons, based on the same genocidal philosophy. So why did all of this death happen? Why did this terrible treatment of people happen? Because someone had an idea about how we got here and they removed God from the picture. What are you going to end up with? But how does all this apply? Looking into applications, we'll say a few things. One, we'll go back to our original idea that the misuse of a thing does not negate its proper use. In the case of Darwinism, the question is, like we said, is there a proper use of Darwinism? Well, of course, if you're a Christian, the answer is no. There's just not a use for Darwinism, because it doesn't explain anything that the Bible does not. And of course, it contradicts what the Bible does explain. But even beyond just that, the theory itself, I think to a certain extent, probably promotes the ideas of racism, but even before that, it allows for the ideas of racism fully to take place. To say that I'm better than somebody else based on arbitrary characteristics. So, any kind of hierarchy of evolution, even if you're just trying to apply it to animals, it still has to apply to humans just the same. And if it does, there will be some pretty bad discrimination that results from it. Well, like we mentioned, the Bible has been misused as well. So is it backwards to say this quote that the misuse of things does not negate its proper use, and say that Darwinism doesn't have a proper use, but the Bible does? Even though the Bible's been just as misused as Darwinism? Well, that does make sense, but the problem with the Bible being misused is that the Bible is misused in spite of what it teaches. Does it make sense? The Bible was misused to carry out slavery and acts of racism for a long time, but it was done in direct opposition to what Scripture teaches. You had to work your way around some pretty straightforward passages if you were going to teach these ideas. With Darwinism, it's the opposite. You can carry out acts of racism and slavery, and you can do so with support from, or at least no hindrance from, the ideas of Darwinism. So the Bible cannot and does not teach racism. It has to be misused or mishandled in order to do that. But Darwinism cannot teach against racism. It doesn't teach against racism. People will make arguments from Darwinism against racism. They're very weak if you ever look into it. But Darwinism was misused because of its clear teachings. the Bible was misused in spite of its clear teachings. That's the delineation on that point. But another application we can make is about the idea of a missing link. Like I said, people searched for a long time, and they were enthralled to do so for the years after Darwin's ideas came out. And people have still looked, and they've looked for 170 years, or just about. And in all that time, they've found no more credible missing link between any species, not just man and any kind of greater ape, but they've not found a missing link between any two species. So there's really no more evidence today based on the fossil record than there was at the time of Darwin's suggestion of the idea. And yet still people believe it. But I don't know, if we're going to be fair, I guess we can give it another 170 years and we'll check back on it then. But so far, nothing has come up. Doesn't seem likely. Like we said before, Darwin did not invent racism. I don't want you to leave thinking that, but I do want you to leave understanding that he probably did more than any other modern person to allow for the ideas and the evils that would follow him in racism. He allowed for many, many people to think that they were better than others. And you can look at account after account of different genocides, whether that's in Rwanda or whether that's the Serbs and Croats back and forth, or just take your pick. But the idea that we aren't created by God, and the idea that we descended from animal, and therefore some of us might be better off than others on the evolution scale, can lead to all of this racism, and has for many, many years. Right along with that, this is maybe one of the most important points of the lesson, is about the sanctity of life. And we said that Darwinism devalues human life. We think that human life is sacred because the Bible teaches us that. We think a few things. We think the Bible teaches us that God created mankind. That by itself is special. Not only that, but God created us in His image. That makes us very special. And when God created us, He said that we were very good. And God was willing to send His Son just for humanity, that they could be saved. That makes us pretty special as well. So we have inherent value because we are human. The Bible says that it is wrong to kill another human, and that if you kill another human, your blood will be shed as well. So when we put all that together, we say, okay, my life must be worth something. And so is my neighbor's life. It's worth something too. But Darwinism doesn't teach any of that. With Darwinism, there is no creator, of course. You're not created in His image. You weren't created very good. It doesn't matter if someone else kills you, and you don't have any inherent value. What are going to be the natural results of that idea? And we've looked at some of them tonight. And these ideas continue even today. There's still places where ethnic cleansings are taking place as we speak. We don't think about it, but it's still happening. And there's another example of this that you might not tie together. I don't think I'd ever tied it together before this lesson, but there is a global campaign to kill a certain people group that we believe to be less evolved. And so far, I think the number's in the 50 millions somewhere. You heard about it? And this isn't supposed to be, well, the idea that we're talking about is abortion. Why is it that people are able to stomach the idea of killing another human? Because they're less evolved than me. Because they're subhuman from where I'm looking at it, right? It's the same story, it's just a little bit different, but Darwinism allows for that. Because it removes God from the picture, because it allows it to be just another animal, just another organism. And so it's a choice rather than another human life. But what's the truth in all of this? The truth is, of course, from God's Word. And the truth is quite the opposite of what Darwin taught, but Revelation chapter 7. So in verse 9 it says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, of all tribes, of all peoples, of all tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." In heaven, there will be no difference in race because there is no real difference in race. God created all people the same. They did not evolve from anywhere else, but God created them as His own special creation. Tonight, the application is pretty simple. One, of course, don't buy into Darwinism. It has never brought any good into the world. The world has not improved since the ideas of Darwin were introduced. They're, of course, also in direct contradiction to the Word of God, but even if they weren't, they would be terrible ideas to follow because they have brought about terrible results. This lesson has been a study. It's been a look into a particular topic. It's not, anytime you do a study, it doesn't necessarily lend itself into an invitation very well, but the invitation is always extended. The invitation, of course, is to come to God. If you need to for the first time, to become a child of His, or deny if you come to Him for another time, for the 10th time, for the 100th time, doesn't matter. God is willing if you are willing. This evening, if we can help you in any way as the church, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.